This screencast is to support this lesson on the topic of job interviews with some functional language, which involves some verbs with prepositions as the target language. There's some reading at the start and some listening as well, finishing with some speaking, which is a role play. The materials come from Straightforward Upper Intermediate Students Book, 2nd edition, by P. Kerr, Kerr, and C. Jones, and it's published by Macmillan. So let's have a look at the lesson. So the first activity is a speaking activity, and the coursebook gives a little scenario. So a friend is worried about a job interview they have next week and needs some help preparing for it. What advice would you give him or her? So I would quickly get the students into small groups and get them to, after you've elicited an example, get them to come up with as many ideas as possible, and then get some feedback and see how many ideas for different pieces of advice the students have found. So that's a good way to get them thinking about job interviews and the do's and don'ts, if you like. So exercise 2 says, read the advice sheet below and answer the questions. So here's the advice sheet, preparing for a job interview 1, and there's several pieces of advice listed. So as with any reading or listening text, before they read, we need to look through the text and see if there is any what we call blocking vocabulary, anything that's going to impede their chances of understanding the text. So I think these words strengths and weaknesses, it might be useful to try and elicit these before they read. They're useful words. So try and find a way to elicit from the students these two words. And looking through the rest of the text, job requirements might be something worth pre-teaching. Okay, so check the meaning, check the pronunciation. And back up all claims. So back up, you might want to try and elicit that, maybe give them a synonym, support, for example, and see if they can come up with this phrasal verb back up as a word with the same meaning. Okay, so once you've pre-taught a few words and phrases that they need, you can give them the questions and ask them to read the text and answer them. So let's have a look at the questions. Now there are 5 questions, but only 2 of them relate directly to the content of the text. The others 3 ask about opinions and ideas. Okay, so set questions 1 and 2 and give them maybe 4 or 5 minutes to read the text and answer the questions. They can do this alone, and then they can talk together, compare their answers, and you can get some feedback. Questions 3, 4 and 5 are not related directly to their comprehension of the text. So these can be discussion questions for after the reading exercise. Now that they've thought in more detail about advice and things to consider when going for a job interview, they can do this listening. So number 1, listen to Annette being interviewed for John Betterman's job as communications coordinator for the RPA. Did she follow the tips in the advice sheet? So this is referring back to the reading text they've just done. Set this question 1 alone, first of all, and play the audio through and get the students, while they're listening to the audio, to answer this question. When they've finished listening to the audio, they can compare their answers and you can get some feedback. Now that they've listened to the audio once, they can listen again and do exercise 2. Listen again and complete the questions that the interviewer asks. So there are 6 questions, and they just need to listen and fill in the missing information. Again, peer check and feedback. Exercise 3 requires them to listen for a 3rd time and make notes about Annette's answers to the questions in exercise 2. So each time they listen, they need to look at the question beforehand, answer the questions while they're listening, check with their peers after listening, and then you get feedback. And exercise 4 here is some additional discussion questions about Annette. Okay. Set the questions. They can either discuss them in pairs or small groups, or do them alone and check together before you get the answers from them. Make sure for all of the activities so far that they've got visual answers, so that the answers are actually on a slide and not just given verbally. Now we're going to focus on the target language of the lesson, which is functional language around job interviews. So all of this language comes from the audio that they've just listened to. So it has a nice solid context. They need to look at the sentences in A and complete each sentence with a phrase from column B. So basically matching 2 halves of a sentence together. You can do the first one as an example. So I've been working in, and then they have to choose one of these to match together to make a whole sentence. Give them a couple of minutes to do that. Quickly check together to see if they all agree and get the answer. And hopefully they will say that 1 matches with E. I've been working in the communications sector since I left university. Because they've done quite a lot of individual work on the reading and the listening, I'd get them to do the rest of this task in pairs or small groups and see if they can successfully match the parts of the sentences together, and then get some feedback, obviously showing them the completed sentences on a slide. It says in the course book, check your answers in the audio script. So that is actually in the teacher's notes. You can give the students the audio script to check their answers if you want to, or you can just check them yourselves. Giving them the audio script means additional reading, so it's not always the best idea if they've already done some reading in class. Okay, so now they've got 8 complete sentences that we can look at and analyse. So we need to think about the meaning, the form and the pronunciation. So the language we want to pull out of these is work in, work as, involve plus ing, to be good at something, and have a tendency to do something. Okay, so these are all really useful phrases which students will struggle with because of the prepositions and the form, for example, the ing form after involve. So we want to look at these. So how are we going to check meaning first of all? Because meaning always comes first. So we could start off by comparing work in and work as. So work in a sector, a department, work in the communications sector, work in TV, etc. And work as is followed by a profession, isn't it? Work as an English teacher, I work as a volunteer. So you could get the students to match some examples with the correct work plus preposition phrase. that would show that they understand the meaning. Good at. What can you be good at? Elicit some examples from the students. Okay, he's good at cooking, he's good at athletics. So it can be the verb plus ing or the noun. Perhaps elicit some examples of things that your students are good at. And have a tendency to. Perhaps try and elicit the verb form, tend to, which is the same meaning, and ask some concept checking questions around the meaning of have a tendency to do something. Then we need to focus on form. So think about what comes after each of these expressions we've focused on, okay? So for example, involve plus ing. Good at plus ing or good at plus noun. He's good at running. He's good at athletics, for example. So think about the form and what the students need to know about what comes after each expression. And then pronunciation, okay? So think about what happens to the language in a sentence. Are there any weak sounds? Is there any linking? Do they need to think about the sentence stress and any contracted forms, etc.? So do some drilling around that. If you've got time, you can do exercise 2 and get the students to match the sentences to the categories. So the sentences from exercise 1 to these categories in 2. This isn't essential to the lesson, so think about whether you'll have time to include that section. Then we want the students to practice some of this language. So exercise 3 is a nice useful expression. Use expressions from exercise 1 to write 5 sentences about yourself, your past experience and your strengths and weaknesses. So they can use these expressions. I've been working in, I've worked as, or I work as, my job involves, I'm good at, etc., etc. Okay, so you can decide how many sentences you want. It says 5 in the book. I think 5 is quite a nice number. And give them some time to write down some sentences about themselves. And then they can work in pairs or small groups and talk to each other about what they've written. They could do what's in number 4, ask the people listening to them to advise them on what kind of job would be best for them based on what they're good at, what kind of experience they've had, etc. Do get some feedback on what they've written and make sure that their sentences are correct and that they've used this language correctly. The last part of the lesson gives the students an opportunity to practice a job interview and use some of the language that they've learned in the lesson. So there's a role play with 2 different role cards, one for Group A, one for Group B. Put the students into Group A and Group B and give them their role cards. So Group A, look at the job description below and prepare 5 questions. Remember, for reasons of fairness, you must all ask the same questions and look at the areas below to help you think about what kind of questions you're going to ask. Meanwhile, in the second group, Group B, they're looking at the job description and thinking about the advice they've covered in the lesson, and they are going to prepare what they're going to say in the job interview. Once they've had time to prepare notes on what they're going to say, you can bring them back together, put them into pairs, and get them to do the job interview. Monitor this carefully and make a note of any good language you hear and any incorrect use of the language they've been learning in the lesson. Then bring them back together as a group and get them to answer these questions in number 3. The last part of the lesson can be spent doing some post-fluency error correction.